Would you say safely that this is one of the biggest environmental disasters in South Australian history?
I hope people don't go and vote for Good Times Pete, the Premier for Good Times.
You know, the Flinders University, they were quite clear that there was a brevetoxin and neurotoxin in these waters. One was airborne, causing problems to not just dogs and animals, but also to humans.
Yeah, and what breaks my heart, yes, it's seeing all the dead fish, but it's our Premier saying it barely exists. Well, it has diminished along Adelaide's coastline and there's less fish washing up. But do you know why there's less fish washing up? Because they're all dead.
I heard the Premier the other day called the immigrants arse wipers.
I don't even know what to say about that.
Well, everyone, thank you for joining us again with another awesome episode with David Speirs, the former opposition leader. What are you up to?
Thank you, George. Great to be here. And yes, I think it's the worst kept secret in South Australia at the moment, but I do plan to put my hand up to represent my community again and see how I go in the upcoming state election. It's only a few weeks away and we're going to have a short, sharp, shiny campaign and see how we go.
Yes. Well, it's been quite clear in your career that you've always had such a huge influence in your community. You've really cared about it, from the simple things like a small park to the bigger things like roads and infrastructure around that area. What's it been like? What's the reaction been like so far from the people that do know so far? I'm sure you've told a few people, surely.
Yeah, look, people know.
Yeah.
And the reaction has been very positive, or at least as there's been speculation, people have encouraged me to do so. It's hard for me to tell how I will go. I have had a difficult journey in recent years and that's been widely publicised, but I've got a real calling in my life around public service, and I had a great time as South Australia's Environment Minister for 4 years, a more challenging time as South Australia's opposition leader. But first and foremost, it was always about my local community. I got elected in 2010 to local council. It's the grassroots stuff. It's the door-to-door, street-to-street, neighbourhood-to-neighbourhood, community to community, and that's why I did the job, and it's what I miss.
Yeah.
Those individual relationships with people in their homes, in their front yards, in their places of work. I felt I was a good local MP. I felt I got things done, and that calling hasn't diminished in my life. If anything, given I've been out of it for a couple of years, it's grown larger.
So let's go into that for a second. Obviously, you mentioned your hardship. What has that been like in terms of your journey from going to, these positions, being an environment minister, being the opposition leader, and then having to deal with the onslaught of the mainstream media kind of, obviously what you did, according to what I've seen, some people go, oh, that's so bad, that's so bad. But in reality, in a human level, it's kind of just like, okay, he's just a human. What was that like to deal with, in a sense where you're being pushed to the forefront of like true vulnerability in that moment?
Oh, it's horrific, George. It's horrific. But let's go right back.
Yeah.
I made mistakes.
Yeah.
And I made big mistakes. I did let people into my home that I probably shouldn't have. I trusted people that I definitely shouldn't have. I was betrayed in the most dramatic way, but I made mistakes at the same time. And because I was someone of profile, I got treated much more harshly in many different ways. But it was because I made mistakes. So yes, the punishment, the treatment, the public humiliation and the media onslaught was harsher, much harsher, to a multiple of hundreds of times over than the average person would ever receive. That's my view. But I made mistakes. So yes, the punishment was harsh, and the punishment, forget a legal punishment, the punishment was the public humiliation in the mainstream media, the relentless hounding. I was crushed, I was ground into the ground. They come for you, they seek to kill you, and when they've killed you, they seek to kill your corpse.
Yeah,
But I made mistakes.
Of course. So look, I mean, everyone makes mistakes, and I'm glad that you've owned your mistakes, because that's an important thing. Sometimes people never own their mistakes. They can live their whole lives denying something, and that's kind of sad to watch when someone has obviously made a mistake and they deny it. That's kind of worse, in my opinion. But it just felt strange that, for example, the news outlets went so hard, and I want to ask you directly, did you did you do anything to these people? Like, what was it? Like, why was it seem so personal? It was so weird to watch.
And I think this is something that's raised with me a lot in the community. The people in the community that I represented are uncomfortable with what they perceive as media overreach. I will always come back again. I made mistakes, you own it. I worked through that legal process. And for your listeners who don't know and are frantically Googling me at the moment, I'm making sure they spell my name right, E before I in Speirs. However, and they'll Google a lot of nonsense about me because there's a huge amount of sensational untruths in the mainstream media about me. But I think what's most important to come back to is why the perceived overreach, why the constant day in, day out media stories. There's still almost daily media stories in the Adelaide Advertiser about me. They write a story every other day that I'm about to announce my candidacy, and then I don't, and then they just write another story. It's an incredible thing to be under such intense vilification. Now you ask why. I will never know why for sure, but maybe it was a mistake on my part, but I never built a meaningful relationship with the Adelaide Advertiser when I was a minister or leader of the opposition. I guess maybe I overlooked it, but for me, I just wanted to be me. And I'm not someone that wanted to go and kowtow to the mainstream media. I just couldn't do it. I fronted up to the media. I was always present. I was very accessible as a politician. But I didn't kiss the ring, so to speak. And I think I got punished for that. There was also a moment when I was asked by some cadet journalists one day about negative coverage about myself. How do you deal with that? And I talked about how sports psychologists would say to sports people, you don't read those stories about yourself. You keep your circle tight and you protect your mental health and you focus on the prize. And so I mentioned that I didn't often read stories about myself. And that was actually editorialized within 24 hours, that I didn't read the Advertiser, and so I was not worthy of the role of opposition leader. And I think that's when the Advertiser in particular really locked on to me.
There's a grand conspiracy, I'm not sure if you've heard this conspiracy before, about why the Advertiser dislikes you. And I just want to kind of put it out there and think, hear what you say directly so we can actually get this out of the way. But there's a theory that, for example, during the pandemic, you were you weren't outspoken against the kind of policies that were being put in place, but you weren't happy about it. There was a sense of this is a bit ridiculous, but you never vocalized it. But maybe internally there was some, you made it clear, and that obviously the mainstream media, being the mainstream media, couldn't have that, and that was also sort of like a punishment for your kind of you're not fully being on board with the whole pandemic plan.
I haven't heard that before.
Have you not heard this before?
I'm not a conspiracy theorist per se, but I was never part of the political class in this state. I was a migrant kid who landed in Hallett Cove as a teenager and worked their way up through the community. I wasn't part of the system. I just wasn't part of the system.
An outsider,
I was totally an outsider, and I loved being an outsider. I'm still an outsider.
Yeah.
I think outsiders are rising and rising and rising in politics across the world, and I perhaps will be part of that again, but I was always an outsider. When it comes to the pandemic, there were many aspects of how that was dealt with that I wasn't overly comfortable with, but look, I think by and large I was comfortable with South Australia's approach to that and Stephen Marshall's leadership there. There were some things that grated against me, in particular some of the levels of the vaccine mandates. One thing I didn't like at all, which was never a mandate, was excluding people from visiting nursing homes. I was quite outspoken behind the scenes on that. The government never said you couldn't keep people from visiting their relatives in nursing homes. There might have been moments in time when that was advisable, but there was never any direction. And I really spoke up. I saw that as a catastrophic thing to happen. I knew many people who died through loneliness during that season. Not from COVID, but through loneliness. So I wanted to see a bit more pragmatism around that, but hindsight gives you 2020 vision. We didn't have that, and look, my view was that the pandemic was managed as well as it could be, given there was no rule book and it was a very hard time. I was in cabinet. I saw it firsthand.
Yeah, well, look, part of the reason I brought this theory up was because obviously, Cory Bernardi, leader of One Nation at the moment, is pretty outspoken. He's very upset about how the pandemic was handled by Stephen Marshall's government. And that's one of his cornerstones of his campaigning at the moment. It's one of the first things he said during our interview. So I thought, okay, well, I've got you here. I might as well ask you, what did you truly feel? And I think people appreciate knowing, because it was a tough time for everyone on every single level. Look, I'm just happy we didn't end up like Melbourne, Victoria.
No, we did very well compared to that, which was a police state. We were close to it, but we weren't there. Now, just to reflect a little bit more on the pandemic, most of the people you interview weren't in the room. I was in the room. And I was a cabinet minister sitting at the table, attending cabinet. We would meet almost every day. And we would work through the most complex issues, trying to keep South Australians safe. Did we get it all right? Far from it. Did we try our best? I think we probably did. Now, I might have not been in the inner circle, but I was watching. I was raising concerns along the way, as other cabinet ministers would have. It was just a really hard time. And I would have liked... I often say that some of the restrictions at the beginning were probably justified because there was so much uncertainty as to what this illness could do to people. And I remember being anxious. I was overseas when the pandemic started. I was actually in the USA for my brother's wedding and had to have a sort of mercy dash back to Australia. But as that pandemic continued, I thought, this will be 6 weeks, this will be 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 12 months, 18 months. It dragged on. It had catastrophic impacts on the economy. My grandkids will be paying back the debt that was racked up during COVID. There is also a whole range of other questions to be asked about the vaccine mandates. I did push back a bit behind the scenes about some of those mandates. And I'm never going to discuss what was discussed in cabinet, but you are right to raise that I was maybe a little bit more skeptical than others.
Yeah, I think obviously the way when you were speaking during the pandemic, I think that's kind of what gave birth to this theory, because you kind of seemed a bit disgruntled about it all. When you could see in the interviews when asked about it, you would just seem frustrated. So look, it's good that we've cleared up that, because I think a lot of people were curious on that. And it's just good to know that there was a diverse kind of thought process happening within cabinet. It wasn't just everyone followed whatever, it was a bit more,
Yeah, look, I was in there. There was debate about everything. And one thing I can say, we were always at least trying to reduce restrictions. And we need to remember that in South Australia, yes, we had those mandates, which weren't great. Yes, the borders were shut, but our lives went on pretty normally for most of that time, as normal as you could be.
Yeah.
And you're right to emphasise the Socialist Republic of Victoria next door, where many people died, not of COVID, but from suicide and mental health illnesses, and are still dying today as a consequence of that, because they were treated with the most disrespect and the most heartless approach, and I'll never get that.
Yeah. Well, going into disaster, obviously, I want to kind of touch on this a little bit and then move back to what we're talking about in regards to your career. But we have the algae situation, which is kind of like, I would say, even like one of the worst disasters in our history in South Australia, especially on a marine level. You've been through a disaster in your own sense. How have you seen the way the Premier has handled this disaster in terms of the algae bloom? Do you think he's got away with it a little bit in terms of his responsibility, or do you think there was nothing he could do and it is what it is? Well,
this is something that has made me consider seriously running for election. It's a catalyst for me putting my hand up again, because it should be a central election issue. It should be being discussed daily, and it should be at the heart of policy releases and investment strategies going forward. I was Environment Minister for 4 years, so I know South Australia's environment and I know the marine environment. Not only that, I represented a coastal electorate and I live by the beach. And it's absolute devastation. And what breaks my heart, Yes, it's seeing all the dead fish, but it's our Premier saying it barely exists. A couple of weeks ago, our Premier said it barely exists. Well, it has diminished along Adelaide's coastline and there's less fish washing up. But do you know why there's less fish washing up? Because they're all dead. So there's less fish because there's no fish anymore. They're all dead. And we haven't seen anything yet in terms of the economic impact if it gets to the Eyre Peninsula, which is really one of the seafood capitals of the world. You know, if it hits the Eyre Peninsula, and I believe it probably will in the coming weeks, it will wreak economic havoc. It'll have a massive tourism impact, but beyond that, the seafood industry based in Port Lincoln is phenomenal. And it will be smashed to pieces by this algal bloom. The oyster industry, the tuna industry, the impact on abalone farming, the sardine industry. There are so many different fishes out there in that southern Eyre Peninsula region and the waters of that region. This is going to be absolutely catastrophic. The Premier does appear to have gotten away with this, and I would say that the only person with a coherent recovery plan in the public domain is me. So in November, I released an algal bloom recovery plan. It's got 9 platforms. It tries to pivot away from the disaster because the disaster has happened. And sometimes you have to accept disaster and look to recovery. We might in time look at why that disaster occurred, and we should. But we need to look at what recovery looks like. And that's what I've spent an extended amount of time digging into. How do we recover from this? How do we turbocharge recovery? How do we actually create a situation where the natural environment is healthier than it ever has been because we use the algal bloom as a catalyst for investment and a catalyst for change? I believe that's what the community wants, and it is not happening at all.
So what was the reception like when you released these ideas? Did you get good reception?
Yeah, it's been really good. It's been really good because I think people were hungry for ideas and they were hungry for hope. The algal bloom has had a devastating impact. I paddleboard. I spend a lot of time out in the water, out from Merino and Seacliff, where I live. You look out there used to be a coming together of different habitats, a rocky habitat, seagrasses and a sandy environment, all coming together out at Kingston Park, Merino, Seacliff. And everything's dead. Everything is dead.
What was that like for you seeing that?
Oh, it's devastating because I'd be out there on a nice still day in my paddleboard, carry it down from home and get out in the water, and you'd see schools of hundreds of fish below you, blue swimmer crabs, and most significantly actually stingrays. One of the biggest cluster of stingrays in Australia was found off the coast at Seacliff. They're all gone.
Wow.
And these are a long-lived species, so you don't get them back like that. They're not like little fish that will breed out and come back in. These take decades to come back.
Wow, that is
and we've lost them all. So we
sad.
need to look at recovery. And what does recovery look like? Seagrass meadow restoration. Getting the shellfish reefs that used to be 500 meters to 1,000 meters offshore pre-European times, right along South Australia's coastline. They were places of habitat, they purified the water, native oysters would suck the water in, out, clean it up. This sort of thing needs to be restored. We've done it before. We've got the science. It's pretty easy, in fact. We built a great one when I was Environment Minister out from Glenelg at the mouth of the Padawalunga River. So we look at the seagrass restoration, the native shellfish reef restoration, and then we look at what's happening on the land, stormwater runoff, rivers, all the dirt, the pollutants, the heavy metal, glyphosate, that sort of thing that flows off the land and into our marine environment. Now, that reduces resilience. And then when something pretty natural, because algae is natural, when it comes along and it goes big, why does it go big? Because we've reduced the resilience of our coastline to fight back by dumping all sorts of crap in there. And that comes out our stormwater drains and our rivers and our creeks. How do we fix that? Wetlands. Slow the water down in wetlands, let sediment settle, and cleaner water, not necessarily the cleanest, but cleaner water heads out into the Gulf.
That's actually quite unique to hear because I've only heard people trying to figure out what happened. And obviously part of that is obviously the River Murray, the Great Floods. People have mentioned desal plants. Have you heard much into the desal plants? Like, have you looked into the
Everything's hypothetical. The government has its hypothesis that it's pushing. It could be right, but I don't think we really know.
Yeah.
we know that algae is naturally occurring, but something changed in the environment that made it go big. The water was warmer for a period. I'm sure that had an impact. People talk about the desal plant. I don't feel equipped to talk about the desal plants around South Australia's coastline, but anything that introduces a foreign product into our marine environment will reduce its resilience. So I talked about the rivers and the creeks pouring out all sorts of rubbish into the sea, reduces resilience. Putting out a brine substitute substance, which is what happens through the desalination process. You suck out all the salt, push it back in. There's no doubt that the presence of that is going to reduce the resilience. Is it the sole cause? I don't think so necessarily. Is it a contributor? Quite possibly. Yeah. And it ought to be looked at rather than dismissed. The Premier's approach has been too much about, here's a voucher, go and have your fish and chips and get down the beach. It's all still fine. Well, it's not. Everything's dead. We need to recover, and we don't really know why this happened.
Yeah, it's quite funny when we were pressing the Premier quite a bit on these topics, and even when he was doing his little homemade videos, he didn't even eat the fish.
No.
He didn't even.
No.
He ate the oyster, I think.
I don't blame people for not going down the beach, especially with their dogs. Yeah. And I live by the beach. I look at the beach every day. I run down the Esplanade every day. I'll have a swim on occasion, but you are cautious. If you've got kids, if you've got pets, I'm happy to take the risk myself, but I don't blame people for being cautious.
Well, I think what made it worse and exacerbated all of it was the fact that, the Flinders University, they were quite clear that there was a brevetoxin and neurotoxin in these waters. One was airborne, causing problems to not just dogs and animals of the fish and marine life, but also to humans. Yeah. We had cases where humans would go out. I had friends who would go surfing and come back completely covered in rashes.
There's no doubt about that. And that's when the algal bloom was initially identified down on the southern Flurio, when people were surfing at places like Waipinga, absolutely stunning beach down in the south coast west of Victor Harbour. They were coming out and they were scratching their eyes, they had respiratory problems. And it appears that most of the people who were susceptible to that were maybe asthmatic or had eczema already. Again, I'm no scientist, I don't know, but the people that I spoke to, they seem to maybe have a vulnerability, and the algal bloom really exacerbated that vulnerability. And I hear those stories all the time because I am a coastal dweller. I live by the coast, and it is a fundamental part of my life.
Yeah, I think that was like the most annoying part, was that it just felt like the Premier kind of overlooked that there could be an issue.
It took the government a huge amount of time to catch on to the fact that this was an issue. And then it took a significant amount of time to get an action plan into place. And now we're taking a long, long time to get a recovery plan into place. And it's too much spin, spin, spin. Some of your listeners would have received what the government calls their summer plan. And it's 16 pages long, and the first environmental initiatives are listed on page 14 of 16. I think that is a catastrophe. I think it's a disgrace.
Would you say safely that this is one of the biggest environmental disasters in South Australian history?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think, you could say, and some of your listeners will think this is a strange thing to say, but you could say that the biggest environmental impact in our state is the arrival of Europeans, because they, cleared lots of vegetation and set up cities here. Of course, that had a big impact. But if you exclude that one, the arrival of Europeans setting up the great city of Adelaide and our regional settlements, if you exclude the impact that they had, this is probably the single biggest disaster we've had. We've had big bushfires in the Adelaide Hills over the years, of course. We've had other challenges with drought, and the Millennium Drought was obviously an environmental disaster of sorts. Yeah. But I think in terms of a focused environmental disaster that has devastated an environment, being the marine environment in this state, the near marine environment, the first couple of Ks of coastal environment, the devastation on the seabed, the loss of sea life, the economic impact, which sits on top of all of that, absolutely catastrophic.
Yeah, come to think, I would say this one and definitely the Kangaroo Island fires would probably be the top two, eh?
Yeah, they would, and I was heavily involved in the Kangaroo Island fires, but absolutely devastating, and we shouldn't diminish that. But if you look at the area impacted, the species impacted, the recovery required of the algal bloom, it's much greater.
Wow.
I've been to KI many times since those fires, because I was intimately involved in the recovery there. And look, nature's an amazing thing. It has bounced back significantly on Kangaroo Island, and we give thanks for that. But I think the bounce back for our marine environment will be much, much slower.
Wow.
Australia's landscape's used to being burnt. We put things in the path of those fires that has a greater impact, and with habitat reduction and less places for wildlife to refuge, of course, the impact's significant. But we bounce back from fire relatively easily. I'm not sure we know how to bounce back from an algae bloom that's not natural. You say fire is quite natural. The algae itself is natural, but the impact is unnatural because of the lack of resilience in our coast.
I kind of want to pivot towards the Liberal Party at the moment, which seems like...
It's quite a pivot.
Yeah. Well, I just thought, obviously, because you had such a huge impact on the Liberal Party as Environment Minister, obviously as Opposition Leader. I mean, I guess you'd have a deep, fond, look, like you almost would you ever look back at your past and go, oh, I love those times? Or were they always a bit of a struggle?
I loved being the Environment Minister, and I loved representing my beloved community. I didn't enjoy being the Opposition Leader, but I owe the Liberal Party a fair bit, because I would never have been elevated into Parliament with the David Speirs logo. You know, I think sometimes politicians have tickets on themselves as to how much their personal brand is worth. I think down the track, I built that personal brand and became a fairly independent figure in my own right in the local community. But I only got where I got because the Liberal Party put its trust in me back in 2012 when they pre-selected me for the former seat of Bright, Somerton Park to Hallett Cove. So very grateful for the Liberal Party. I still have a lot of friends in the Liberal Party, and keep in reasonably close contact with them.
So what was that like from 2012 when you first joined? What was the Liberal Party like versus what it's like now?
Well, the Liberal Party had a lot of hope associated with it. When actually Isabel Redmond was the leader. Some of your listeners will have to Google Isabel. She's a great lady, a real friend of mine. She was the leader when I was pre-selected way back then as a 27-year-old. Then Stephen Marshall became the leader, and Stephen was energetic, focused on taking us into government, professionalising the party. It was a pleasure to be part of. It was exciting. And I knew, or felt, when I was pre-selected, that I stood a pretty good chance of entering Parliament. The seat that I was seeking to represent was very marginal, and I thought I could pivot from pre-selection into Parliament in a pretty straightforward way. And I achieved that. I gained that seat from Labour in the 2014 election. But I think the 2014 election was interesting in that we fell short there, and we probably fell short because we didn't give the people enough vision and enough focus. We won in 2018 because it was time for Labour to have a bit of time in the wilderness, and the Electoral Commission changed the boundaries because it was found that the boundaries had an inbuilt bias towards the Labour Party. That's not because people were doing the wrong thing necessarily. I don't believe so at all. It was just over time, population movements and a lack of boundary changes had given Labour an unnatural advantage. And so the boundaries were redrawn, and the redraw of the boundaries delivered us government. In fact, in 2018, this is rarely analysed, the Liberal Party formed government with a swing against it. I'm not sure how often that happens in politics anywhere in the world outside of dictatorships. We formed government, but there was a small swing against us, complicated by a guy called Nick Xenophon, populist independent, coming up through the middle and creating a bit of chaos. South Australia is used to chaos in its political environments. We didn't look closely enough in 2018 as to why there was a swing against us. I'm not sure we looked at that election result at all. We'd formed government. That comes with responsibility and busyness. Lots of us went off and became ministers and started to do things that ministers do. And we didn't get an opportunity, or we chose not to. We, being the corporate party, chose not to really delve into that. And I think that result in 2018 hid some underlying problems around what the party stood for, who they stood for, and what they took to the election.
So seeing it now, because I mean, look, some of the criticism, obviously, of One Nation surging through in the polls, and it's been pretty dramatic. And I guess Pauline Hanson, being in the work for 30 years, her message has been quite singular. anti-immigration, or now mostly anti-mass immigration, is kind of the message, and that seems to have reached a lot of South Australians and even South Australians now. Do you think the Liberal Party missed out on that kind of foresight? Do you think they kind of ignore it, or do you think this was always bound to happen eventually? Because we obviously see populist movements throughout the entire world. With UK, for example, I'm sure you just got back from Scotland sometime.
Yes, yeah.
So I'm sure you've seen it firsthand what mass immigration and illegal immigration has done to those countries. Do you see Australia falling into that trap where they could, have a problem where we've got so many people coming in so quickly, and obviously for economic reasons, the Labor Party want to cover up their GDP and flood the people in.
Yeah.
I heard the Premier the other day called the immigrants arse wipers.
I don't even know what to say about that. Many of your listeners would have heard that comment, and I'm just flummoxed why a political leader would talk like that. I think he thought he was being, relevant. Yeah. He does a bit of that. It was misguided at best and just ridiculous at worst.
Well, he doubled down, and this is the theory, and I think it's quite a good theory. I think the Premier, they are playing this, we are Labor right.
Yes.
They're playing this, we are the right wing of the Labor Party. But when you look at how they vote and the policy they put through, it's it's not far, it's far left, if anything. Particularly, the Premier likes to call himself a Catholic, but then when he goes down to voting, for example, on abortion issues or whatever, he doesn't act like a Catholic. No Catholic would vote that way. So he says one thing, but his actions show the other. And I think what the Premier's done really well here is he's managed to fool the people of South Australia in thinking that he's this secret right-winger. But in reality, he's not.
I think the Premier is a very good politician. I think he's very good at saying very little about a lot. And I think he comes across as a reasonable bloke that you wouldn't mind hanging out with down at the Seacliff Hotel, in my case, or your local watering hole. He is a decent bloke. I've dealt with him for many years. He's always been decent to me. But we have to remember that the Labour Party in South Australia is in pursuit of one thing. It's power. They are interested in the pursuit of power as a means to an end, not as, and that end is further power for them. I've witnessed it. They like the big pay packets. They like the drivers. They like the corporate hospitality. They like their snouts in the trough. And I think the Premier will come undone in the future, and his team will come undone when people start to wake up to that. They won't wake up to it while we have a completely ineffective opposition. And the Labour government, the current Labour government, have been very good at giving the people distractions. We've got Gather Round. I love Gather Round, but we've got Gather Round. We've got Live Golf. Less of a fan of Live Golf, but whatever. Lots of people like it. We've got the car race called Clipso Valo. I don't know what it's called at the moment, but the Adelaide 500 street circuit. And now we've just been told we've got the Moto GP.
Yeah.
They are circuses. We might like the circuses, that's the point of circuses, but they distract from the main things. They distract from skyrocketing state debt. They distract from a hospital system that isn't working very well. They distract from particularly regional infrastructure, which is under massive pressure. And we should be aware of those things when we're voting. I hope people don't go and vote for Good Times Pete, the Premier for Good Times. I hope they consider the bigger policies for our state around infrastructure, jobs, and things like that. Now, we've jumped around a little bit here. Let's go back to the migration issue.
Yep.
That is something that took a while to come to Australia. We were lagging behind a populist movement around migration, which was unfolding across the world. We've got Trump's America. Obviously, I am not from Australia originally. I've got this giveaway accent. I'm from the UK. The Reform Party has surged in the UK in recent years. We've got the Scottish elections in 12 weeks' time, and Reform have no MPs. I think they might have one that jumped over across the floor or something like that. But they've got no elected MPs in the Scottish Parliament. They will become the official opposition in a few weeks' time.
Wow.
From no MPs. They could win government in Wales and will certainly become the official opposition in Wales in the elections which are on the same day. So we've got these movements across the world. We had One Nation sitting there, sort of in the sidelines, waiting for this time, and the times suit them. The times suit them globally, and they were a ready-made political prospect. So I'm not surprised by it. I am surprised by the extent of the One Nation surge, but I think that could be attributed significantly to the major parties not being clear about what they stand for and who they stand for. Now, was I a good opposition leader? Look, I thought I did an okay job in tough times, and I think most commentators would say that. My departure from politics was unrelated to my time as opposition leader, but for my 2 and a bit years as opposition leader, I tried to hold it together. It was a hard job. 2 things I tried to do a lot of, though, we're talking about values. What we stand for and who we stand for. I always said we will govern for everyone, but if a Liberal Party is in power in South Australia, there are areas we'll focus in on. We will focus on the concept of freedom, letting people get on with their own lives within reason. We'll focus on the concept of the family. You know, it takes lots of different people to raise a child, it takes a village, some people say, but the concept of the family is a timeless one and should be supported and looked after. We would take a great deal of effort and opportunity, effort to look at opportunity. How do you give people the opportunity to get ahead, get out of their way as a government, give them a hand up rather than a hand out? Those were the sort of things that I wanted us to focus relentlessly on, rather than just spraying money all over the place as governments do with all these different bribes. You know, I don't mean in a corrupt way, but I mean, you know, promising to resurface the local tennis court if you vote for us and things like that. That's nice, it shows value in community, but is it really what a state government should be about? I think not. I think we should be about those big issues around freedom, family, opportunity, and so on. And then who do you stand for? Govern for everyone, but particular people and groups should think that if the Libs are in power, they should be really upheld and supported. Small business owners. I used to say, and I got criticised for this, we're not about big business. And I had no interest in big business. None at all. Why? Because big business can look after itself. South Australia really doesn't have any big businesses, by the way, so I don't know why I was criticised for it, because I wasn't even criticising anyone in this state. But big business, these are the woke corporates. You know, your Qantases and your big banks and your big four consulting firms, Deloitte, Ernst & Young, things like that, Wesfarmers. These are the ones that pay homage to the latest fad or trend, rather than just selling us our biscuits and our fruit and veg and things like that, and our timber, if I'm talking about Bunnings. Big business didn't need a voice. They had their own voice. They showed that during the Voice campaign with all the corporate donations. Small business needs a voice. They need a voice to get rid of bureaucracy or help them through bureaucracy. They need a voice to reduce taxation so that they can get ahead. They need a voice just to help them establish, to get off the ground, to survive and to thrive and employ a family member and employ a local person and maybe 2 or 3 local people. That is what the Liberal Party should be about. Supporting small business, supporting individuals to get ahead, supporting people who live in the regions, you know, our great regions in South Australia. I've travelled them day in, day out as opposition leader. They should be able to rely on the Liberals to say, we're not city-centric, we're getting out there to Port Lincoln, Port Augusta, Port Pirie, Renmark, Berry, Mount Gambier, Naracoorte, Lucendale, Kingscourt and Kangaroo Island, you know, Clare, Ceduna. We've got such great regions, and a Liberal Party should stand for those people. So we need to know what we stand for, we being the Liberal Party. It's not me anymore, but let's say I'm speaking from that perspective, and who we stand for. And I think they failed massively on that.
Let's go into, you talked about big business, right?
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that is quite clear is big business has kind of lessened its desires of health. Like, you see foods full of microplastics now, GMOs, the fertilizers, and you have those Pasadenas and those nice supermarkets that have organic fruits and veggies and stuff like that, with non-GMO. But do you think that, we look at our birth fertility rates. We have almost extinction levels of birth fertility rates in Australia. Microplastics is a huge deal. We have the same testosterone levels. 18-year-olds have the same testosterone levels as 70-year-olds now.
Yeah.
Do you think this is also why it's so important to support small business, and why it was kind of hard? It's hard to see the Liberal Party kind of losing its grip on that, because without small business, we're not going to have access to these organic fruits as much as we want, and all these other things. Do you think that plays a big part for you on a health level?
Well, look, I'm really into health and well-being, and one of my ways of recovering through my mental health challenges has been to start running. I'm probably fitter and healthier than I've been for many years, and I'm loving that. It's been really, really good for me. So supporting people from all walks of life to be healthy and to live their best life is something that I'm focused on. We need to be supporting small business. All political parties should. I'm not sure we've got any who are really clear at the moment about what small business support looks like. It's not about handing them grants. It's about getting alongside them and moving rules and regulations away from them so that they survive and thrive and get off the ground. I can't remember the percentage, but it's a huge percentage of millennials and Generation Z young people want to start a business, and we need to be helping them do that. They don't want to work for a boss. Now, when it comes to big business, their interest in profits is way above their interest in community. I've got a good example, and that is Boral. Boral's the concrete and quarrying company. I've got a Boral quarry in my electorate, or my former electorate. It sits in behind Marino and Seacliff Park, and it's a huge hole in the ground. It sprays dust all over the community. My house is one of the ones that gets covered in dust. It makes people unwell, respiratory problems. It gets solar panels covered in dust. It just spoils our lives in those suburbs. And Boral just had a 140-year lease extension. 140 years has been added to their lease in recent years, with no significant increase in the regulations and stipulations of how they operate. So they rip stuff out of the community, but they don't sponsor the footy club, they don't sponsor the surf club, they're not alongside the local community garden, they're not there with the friends group that look after the national park. Like, at least give us some money back in the community. And that's not necessarily the best way to support a community, ripping stuff out of the ground and giving a little bit of money back as hush money, but at least give us something. It's one example of big business just taking and not giving, and we see it time and time again. I think we see it with our big mining companies, quite frankly. The extraction of our gas, expansion, it's exporting offshore, and profits not provided back into the community as community dividends, whether that's through sponsorship, whether it's through royalties that reduce our taxation and build our infrastructure through government revenue. That is just not happening. We should be one of the richest, cleanest countries on earth, but we send everything offshore. We don't do a lot of value adding here. We make a few billionaires, bigger billionaires, and we don't translate that down to everyday life. Now, I think that is one of the reasons we see a party like One Nation, and we see independents, people like David Pocock, and a lot of your viewers and listeners won't like David and what he has to say, but he is talking truth to power about some of these big issues. One Nation's doing it, maybe in a different style, maybe in a different way, definitely in a different place, not Canberra, but people are hungry for their political leaders to have their backs and not be cozying up to big business.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I think it's like we make more tax from beer tax than we do from
and
gas.
I think that's something that David Pocock exposed, and good on him. I look at him and I think that's a guy who, again, he might be a bit Canberra centric. He's the MP for Canberra. It's a different world, come on. no place more dissimilar than normal Australia than our capital city. But he reflects the views of many of his residents, of course. But he has highlighted in recent days that we make more money from the taxation of beer than from the royalties from some of our resources, and that I think people find breathtaking.
Yeah, it's not even just if you talk about foreign lobbies or foreign nations or like America or countries in the Middle East or companies from the USA, whatever, they have a huge influence in Australian politics.
I think that's what the people are increasingly wanting. And we discussed a moment ago about how this was a global movement. This was a movement coming out of America, out of Europe, the rise of reform in the UK. The people want their country to be looked after. People say charity begins at home. Now, does it? Well, that's certainly what people want. We need to touch on migration because we talked about it and I don't think we delved into it. I'm a migrant.
Yeah.
You can hear what's coming out of my mouth. It's not an Aussie accent. Go back to Scotland and they're like, you speak like you're from home and away, David. I don't speak like I'm in Summer Bay. Like, let's face it.
Really?
But usually my cousins, they're like, oh, you have such an Australian accent.
Really?
And I'm like, that's my cousin Rachel. Rachel, that was an impression of her. And Jonathan and David. My other cousin's called David. I better name Andrew as well. Andrew, Jonathan, David, Rachel. I hope they're listening to this podcast. They do listen to my podcast. I love those guys. But they think I have an Aussie accent. Anyway, my point is, don't want to go off on a tangent about my cousins on the farm in Scotland. The point of all of this is that I am a migrant and I'm part of a great migrant nation where people come here as migrants. A migrant kid to Hallett Coveney can become the opposition leader. We should celebrate that. A migrant comes from Greece 40, 50, 60 years ago. They buy some land around Norwood. They do a market garden somewhere. They make lots of money. They invest. They build themselves up. They get their kids to a decent school. Their kids are professionals in all sorts of different jobs. We can talk about the same with the Vietnamese, the Italians. That's what our country's built on. And of course, before that, a massive wave of British migration post-war. That is this country's fabric. And goodness, we should celebrate it and shout it from the rooftops. So we shouldn't be anti-migration because we are the ultimate migration nation. And I will never be anti-migration. I'm a migrant. The hypocrisy would be writ large. However, we got to get much better at our migration now. There's no doubt people want less migration. And they want smarter migration. Less migration means having pretty clear, tight quotas about how many people and where they go and is the infrastructure in place, etc. And then smart migration. We actually need more people building houses and doing a whole range of professional jobs. There are industries we have shortages in. My parents came on skilled migration visas to fill those shortages in the early 2000s. There is no reason why we can't have a smart, nimble migration system. I don't want us to be demonizing migrants because they have and will continue to do so much to build Australia. As I said, the ultimate migration nation. But when you get here, accent or not, become Australian. Become part of this country. Get involved. Give back. Don't have your own little enclaves. Mix in with the community. Go down the footy club. I went down the surf club. Bryden Surf Club. Became a surf lifesaver because on home and away everyone was lifesavers. I'm like, I better do that. Forget my skin. Lots of sunscreen required. But that's the sort of thing I did. And I volunteered with the local environment group and went on council and state parliament, an opposition leader. How good's that for a migrant? That's what we need our migrants to do. I'm not the case study for successful migration, but we want our migrants to contribute, to provide meaningful skills, and to invest in this nation. We shouldn't demonize it, but we've got to get a lot better at administering good quality migration. And I think that common sense approach is what people are after.
Yeah, I think that's it, because one thing, you mentioned Scotland, Greece, Italians, one thing we all had in common is we all came from European Christian countries, essentially. And the Vietnamese, obviously came after the war, and there was a lot of issues with the Vietnamese when they first came here. A lot of violence. I know people who were stabbed when they were first brought in because they came from a war-torn area, and there was
a lot of trauma.
Well,
and many people move migrate for lots of different reasons. They migrate for economic reasons, new opportunities. They migrate for love, family reunions, things like that. They migrate because of persecution, and we've been very good at getting our arms around cohorts that have been persecuted, the Vietnamese being a big part of that, and those people come with trauma, and we probably didn't get supporting that trauma quite right, but gee, we've done well with our Vietnamese community. Our last governor was Vietnamese.
Yeah, I guess my point is that it was a number that was sustainable and doable, and I think when the issue now, I think most people is like, because there's so many this is the most in our history. Like I said this on my interview with Corey Bernardi, I said there was like a hazing effect. Like when the Greeks first came here, there was like almost a hazing effect with the Anglos and the Australians. You kind of had to like get cold a few names and rustle and tussle, and there was the banter and the laughter and the jokes and the culture kind of mixing together, and the Greeks having to go, okay, well, we need to kind of become a bit more Anglo-sized into the Australian way of life. Yeah. But the numbers was a lot, but not as much as it is now. Now it's like you're seeing entire neighborhoods completely shifting, not just demographically, but culturally are shifting. And I think that's where Australians are getting their fear from. It's like they're seeing their country kind of shift so quickly that they're losing that identity that they would associate with Australia. There isn't that time for people to kind of assimilate in and have that hazing effect and that. And also, and not just that, the wokies, this is another thing, the issues, the wokies are always on your case. Like, so if you were to be a little bit banterish towards a community, the wokes would, the Karens are called, the Karens would come like, oh, you can't say that, you can't say it. It's like, no, banter is part of Australian life. There's a bit of a hustle and bustle. When I went to school, I was a Greek, right? My father was an immigrant. There was like that, I get to deal with that banter from my Aussie friends, and like it was never from a place of pure hatred. It was almost like a rite of passage almost.
Yeah, and I had plenty of that banter too.
I'm sure you would have your accent. You know,
we can't understand you, but importantly, you know, it did come from a decent place. I'm not sure if you use the word hazing or just friendly banter. I do think there's too much fear now. Some of the fear might be misplaced, but it's fear there all the same. People do fear the creation of enclaves. I think that's probably more of an issue in Sydney and Melbourne in particular than in Adelaide, just because the majority, a small percentage of migrants come to Adelaide. In fact, from memory, we have a below capita share of migrants. So I think we're about 6% of the nation's population, get about 5% of the migrants. We certainly did 2 years ago when I was paying a bit more attention in my previous job. So, you know, we can just do better at this. We can do better in a way that builds community, builds capacity of our nation, and reduces resentment. And we've done it badly. And that's our political leaders. Particularly, it's shouldn't try and pass the buck. It is a federal issue more than a state issue, because of course migration is controlled at that level. But states are a stakeholder in terms of an advocate of the people that they can take, the people that they need, and or the people they can't take and the people that they don't need. So states don't get a get out of jail free card on this. They're a major stakeholder in a federal process.
Going back to the future of South Australia, obviously it looks like One Nation are like going towards becoming the next opposition essentially. And then we're seeing the Liberal Party, obviously we had, you know, Stephen Marshall voted out, then we had a change of leadership from you, then we had Vincent Tarsi, and now we've got Ashton Hearn. So there's quite a bit of volatility there. There's a lot of changes. Do you see any kind of hope back for the Liberal Party in terms of what their future lies? And, you know, obviously you have your new chapter in life now. You're going to do your own thing, and it's going to be quite big because you get to fully advocate for your area. It's going to be amazing for you. But obviously you have a lot of wisdom, and I can see you being in the lower house, applying that wisdom, applying that experience to others around you, which will be very beneficial, I think. But do you feel like the Liberal Party, like what went wrong really? Do you think it was, there's two camps. The Liberal Party went too moderate, and they didn't have their principles anymore. Like you kind of mentioned, you know, you said small business was the principles of the Liberal Party. Yeah. And it was very clear. If you support the Liberal Party, you support small business. What I think most of the criticism comes from is, and this is why One Nation doing so well, is that there's quite clearly principles there. And you might not like these principles. For example, you might be like, you know, anti-immigration or racism, all this stuff that comes sometimes with One Nation. I think that's shifting now. People are not afraid of being called a one nation voter anymore because they're
No, they're
so
not.
worried about their country and their state that they'd rather be called a racist by a woke person than let their country fall to pieces. So what kind of perspective do you look at in terms of the Liberal Party's future, what one nation's going to be moving into, and is there any hope for the Liberals to claw back some sort of power? That would be something I want to hear from you.
Yeah, good question. So I think, firstly, we've referred to my political career. I have to get elected, and that's going to have its challenges. But I am very much of the view that the Liberal Party is not extinct. I think the Liberal Party has major challenges, but if it can right itself, if it can clearly advocate who and what it stands for, it is not out of existence. I've got a lot of time for Ashton Hearn. I think she's a credible, articulate, impressive woman. I think she can lead that party to success in the future. She's going to lose the 2026 state election very, 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 very badly. We all know that. And I feel for her having to go through that process. But if she holds on, I think she will. She's a brilliant local MP. And she can sort the party out from the way it operates. She may very well be able to right the ship and work with a range of independents in the lower house and find a coalition on the centre-right to go forward. The Liberal Party just needs to get back to its old values, and you might be articulating them in modern language. You know, we've got the Menzies statement of belief. Well, there's ways of refreshing that. You don't throw out the values, but you might reframe the language and things like that. The Liberal Party and the right of politics in Australia more broadly has to come together, because that's what Menzies did in the late 40s. You know, there was a fragmented post-war group of motley right-wing parties. They weren't very good at working together. Menzies came together, got around them, formed them into the Liberal Party of Australia and took it forward from there with massive success. They've been by far the most successful political party in Australia, by far. But can they do that? Can the right come together? Can it articulate who it stands for, what it stands for? Can they get on with each other? I always found there was always this jostling for position. Labour is a collective. They all shut up and they move ahead carefully. And if you behave yourself, you get the chair of whatever committee. If you behave yourself a little bit more, you get to be a minister. Then they put you out to pasture and bring the new person in. It's beautiful structure, you know. Doesn't lead to shining stars and political life mostly, apart from the ones that end up being the premier and senior ministers. But it creates discipline. The Liberal Party, right across the nation, federal and state, has a reputation of being a rabble. And part of that is in the DNA of the party, the fact that they want merit, good thing. We believe in merit, we celebrate merit. Labour don't. But if you have that merit-based system, you can hustle your way. People more hustle their way to the top, and they stand on people on the way up. And that can be pretty brutal, and it undermines political parties. And in a world of social media where ideas are put forward and get lots of hype very quickly, that can be more damaging in an ill-disciplined environment. So the Liberal Party, if it has a future, it has to be disciplined, it has to know what and who it stands for, and it has to be able to get alongside these other centre-right players and work with them. If they don't, Labour will be entrenched forever.
Yeah, they're almost like the emperor. Do you think the Liberals will ever kind of stop being so soft, I would say, and actually start saying a bit more controversial things that people kind of want to hear and should hear because of the way it's going? You know, obviously with this state, we have $5 billion of debt every single year. We have the highest level of debt in our history. We have a premier who thinks our economy is good because we have numbers of employment, but the employment's coming from the public industry. It's coming from the government industry.
Yeah.
That's not a productive economy. There's no economy in the world that can survive that long like that. So he's kind of telling a false story.
We'll paper over the cracks in this state very quickly rather than trying to build new industries and new things here. We should be looking at what new industries look like and investing in the R&D to get them established. You know, this is really this will not appeal to some of your your listeners for sure. But there's a huge movement in alternate meats. Not for me, they taste like plastic to me. But we were actually looking at seeing if we could establish a big alternate meat processing facility here when we were in government, which would look at using our lentils and beans and things like that to grow in here to really plug into this growing market. Again, I say it's not a market that I'm very interested in. Give me my steak and burgers any day, but it's an opportunity. Labour threw that out. Look at what Stephen Marshall did to advance Lot 14 around space and defence and things like that. Really go-ahead industries. You've got to celebrate some of the things that Stephen did as Premier. That has just been, it's still there, it's still taking over, but we're not leaning into it anymore. We need to be identifying new industries and celebrating them and pushing them forward, because otherwise we will disappear as a state. We cannot be in a situation where a couple of decades from now we're still doing what we're doing now, and that is growing the public sector year in, year out. I'm not saying we need to cut it, I'm saying we need to stop the massive growth, because that might stimulate the economy short term, but who's paying for it? Well, the taxpayer, and a lot of them are going to leave in droves if they can't see a future here.
Well, and the state and the country just doesn't have productivity anymore. I say this a lot, and my viewers know this. In the 1960s, Australia had the same productivity as most European countries. Now, today, we have the same productivity levels as Mongolia.
Our productivity levels are rock bottom, absolutely rock bottom. And I've said to business, some people complain about the price, the rate of wages. I speak to businesses regularly that said, we'll pay top dollar for good workers if we can get productivity out of them. It's not the cost of wages, it's the lack of productivity. And we do need to put the blowtorch to productivity in this nation, not just this state, in this nation. America has way higher productivity than us. It's seen as an entrepreneurial society. It's much more deregulated. It is where entrepreneurs take their businesses from here to grow them from small to very, very large. You don't want a startup in Australia. You want to get a startup to embryonic stage and then switch over to the USA. It shouldn't be like that. Our taxation system hinders productivity. Our regulatory system hinders productivity. Our workplace relations setup hinders productivity. And we've got a productivity commission. I don't really know when the last time a serious set of recommendations from the productivity commission was properly implemented in this state or this nation, and if they are being taken seriously.
My last question is a simple one. It's kind of simple, but it's quite fantasy driven. If you could have the entire population of South Australia in front of you right now, and you're in a stadium and you could look out at all of them and speak to them directly, what would you like to tell them, and what would you like to say to them in a sense where you are at in your life right now and what you're looking forward to doing in the future? And what do they need to hear from David Speirs?
Well, I've hit rock bottom in life, and I'm still standing. And my message would be to give me the chance to give back again. Second chances are not given easily; they are earned. And I want to earn a second chance with my community and this state. And my passion is our natural environment, the stewardship of our environment. It's not a priority for everyone, but it's a priority for me. I think I've got a plan for the algal bloom recovery. I think I've got a plan to give us the healthiest, most vibrant national parks in this nation, if not the whole planet. I think I've got a plan to make this the cleanest, greenest, best place to live in the whole world. And I'd love to work with the people of South Australia, and particularly, of course, my electorate, those suburbs, South Bryden, Kingston Park, Merino, Seacliff, Hallett Cove, Trott Park, Shido Park, that part of the world. Work with them to make that little part of the world the very best that it can be. I have a calling for public service, and will I be successful in the election? Maybe. If not, I still want to front up. I still want to contribute, and I just ask that people give me the benefit of the doubt.
And before I let you go, you obviously mentioned you hit rock bottom, and there's a lot of people out there who are rock bottom right now, what was one insight you learned from everything you've been through that you could share with us that would help anyone else who's dealing with similar circumstances in terms of hitting rock bottom and, you know, that feeling of no hope, but then seeing the light and coming through it? What was your biggest
couple
lesson?
of things. So quite a few people said to me, this too will pass, an old saying, and it did. You know, I had a hard time, as I say, self-inflicted in many ways, and it passed. I got back up, and I got back up because my community stuck with me, and I got back up because I had relationships in that community. The other thing, though, was fitness. I got out and I started to run, I started to move, I got into nature, got out barefoot, you know, earthed myself. Sounds a bit hippie. Sounds a bit hippie. I love it. But I got down there, joined 3 or 4 run clubs. I do my sauna 2 or 3 times a week down at the local recovery centre. I do the hot and cold pools. You know, I've really concentrated on what mental health looks like and what physical health looks like, because they are woven together. And I'm stronger and happier and more resilient than I've ever been.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you being here,
I really
and it was great
appreciate
to
your
see
time,
you
George.
again. And
Thank you.
It's been a while, but no, I'm happy that you're back, and I'm
you.
keen to see what you get up to moving
Thank
forward.
you. Thank you.